a special day for us, as it is my privilege to introduce John Cochrane, a former university professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and also the author of the famous Grumpy Economist blog, or as many put it, the Grumpy Economist himself. Thank you very much, Mr. Cochrane, for accepting the invitation. It means a lot to us. I'm a great fan.
It's a pleasure to talk to you today. So I hope we'll do something interesting together.
Yeah, I hope so. The event will be around 80 minutes, and because Mr. Cochrane has to leave at 9:30. If you have any questions, then raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask the questions, or you can write it through the chat window, both in English and Hungarian. If you're insecure about your English, just put it in Hungarian and I will give my best to translate it.
I have to apologize. My Hungarian isn't very good, meaning zero.
That's fine. You know, paprika and all that. That's the best that everybody from around the world can give it. And we will have two blocks today. The first will be about economic policy, and the second will be about selected issues of economics, mostly things that Mr. Cochrane writes about. And I suggest we just dive in, and first of all, economic policy, and firstly, the Trump years. Of course, the Trump administration is the past now. We have a new administration, but we've just been out of these 4 years. And I think regarding many measures, it's been an interesting experience. And I think we have many issues to discuss related to that. So you're a university professor, Mr. Cochrane. So first of all, I would like to ask you to give a grade to the Trump administration regarding economic policy on a scale from 1 to 5, and please explain your grade.
Okay, well, I'm not going to give a grade, but I will talk about economic policy. Because in part, the question is, do we grade on the curve or do we grade on an absolute standard? I'm a free market libertarian, a conservative libertarian, if that makes any sense to you guys. Yeah. So on the absolute standard of how us free marketers think economy should run, there's easy stuff I think we could do involving reforming the tax code, reforming entitlements, deregulating. Basically the economy should run. I have an apple. Do you want to buy my apple? And that's about it. And that could dramatically increase growth, prosperity, freedom, health, all the things we want. So, on the scale of free market libertarian nirvana, we're not getting there. But on the scale of, what's achievable in two-party politics, I think under the Trump administration, there were some quite remarkable successes. And the more that the policy stayed under the radar and off of the Twitter and away from the frothing at the mouth loathing that Mr. Trump's opposition had for him, the better it was. So the stuff you haven't heard about, I think, is the most important, which was a concerted effort to rein in the excesses of the regulatory agencies. So the U.S. doesn't work by laws anymore. We work by regulatory agencies promulgate regulations. They used to promulgate regulations in a sort of a disciplined fashion. There was a set of legal requirements. Now they're more and more just sort of doing what they want, and now more and more we seem to have elected kings who offer executive pronouncements on what the law shall be. So this was reined in a lot under Trump, and I think what we saw was the economy was booming just before COVID hit. There was a tax reform that took one tiny step in the direction of the kind of tax reform the U.S. should do. So that was good. They made, I think, important steps in the right direction. Some of them fairly radical by the standards of what happens in American presidencies these days. But of course, one could hope for a tremendous amount more. And but that needs bipartisan. So America, small countries. I don't know what's going on in Hungary, but a lot of small countries seem able to reform, and America's kind of stuck on some big needed reforms. Our immigration system is a chaotic disaster, not helped by Mr. Trump. Tariffs were a big step backward under Trump, which unfortunately, that's the one thing that Biden seems to be keeping, is the tariff regime and international backing away from international trade. Our tax code is an unholy crony capitalist disaster, needing any bipartisan coalition could tell you what we need to do. We have a very inefficient version of a European entitlement state, and we don't have the taxes to pay for it. So we got to choose one of the two. I would prefer a dramatic reform of the entitlement program that helps the people it needs to help. And of course, you get the tax system. So there's kind of obvious big things that need to be done, but those things need to be done. You can't have big structural reforms when there's two parties that absolutely loathe each other. And in fact, the capital taxation is a great example. Lowering the corporate taxes was an Obama idea because it's an obvious piece of good economics. And the minute Trump picked it up, then all of a sudden it became, horrible bailout to the rich, and the Democrats changed sides on it. So in that kind of environment, it's hard to get stuff done.
You also mentioned that the economy was booming before the COVID hit. And I would like to ask this question because many economists actually raised the issue that the Trump economic policy was procyclical. And therefore, that's the biggest problem with that. In the middle of an economic boom, there was even more deficits, even bigger tax cuts. What do you think of that matter?
I would encourage all of you to throw this Keynesian claptrap over the bridge into, what's the name of the Danube? Is that, my geography is terrible. And if we think about economies, so in 2008, there's something like lack of aggregate demand and financial problems. But when you're thinking about an economy that is not clearly suffering from financial problems, that is steaming along in its recovery, and then you're thinking about growth, and then we're thinking about supply and freeing up markets. So the kind of things that help there are now politicians don't get much credit for it because you can't be Franklin Roosevelt again and here's the stimulus, and you don't get to hand out money to all your cronies, which is where we're going now. But really, it's a weed the garden approach rather than spread the fertilizer approach. So the kind of things that gets an economy really growing are your labor markets liberalized? Is it easy for people to quit jobs and go get new jobs, or there's a lot of regulation associated with that? Are the taxes disincentivizing people to invest and run things? But the regulations are actually are bigger impediments than the taxes. Is everything being run through politicians rather than through markets? Those are the kinds of things that make an economy really grow. So removing the disincentives to growth at a micro level is, I think, far more important than stimulus, especially when an economy's reached something like full employment. Even the Keynesians will say, look, fiscal stimulus is over here. Borrowing money and throwing it out the window isn't the issue. As certainly the stimulus we did during COVID was just ridiculous. There's a reason that people aren't flying on planes, and it's not because they don't have the money. It's because the planes are closed. You're not allowed to fly on planes. Yes, it was booming, and I think that was a lot due to the microeconomic, the effects of deregulation. I would say largely is what kept the U.S. really going. And so businesses were booming, they were investing, they were hiring. Labor markets were tight, and I think it's actually years and years of stimulus never got down to people with criminal records, minorities, recent immigrants, the kind of people who really have trouble in labor markets. And as of February, just before the those unemployment rates were lower than they had ever been. It was really helping people on the lower end of society, but not from stimulus.
Also, besides the size of the tax cut and the whole package, some issues were raised about the composition of it. Especially, they criticized it because they said reducing the corporate income taxes actually led to share buybacks instead of extra investment. And also, they said that most of the tax decreases went to the richest in society. What do you think about those criticisms?
Both are completely ridiculous. Let's remember, by the way, this was an Obama idea that just changed parties. So it shows you how a lot of American economists are, whatever my team wants, I'll dredge up some argument for. So we're all, I guess we're not all economists here. Share buybacks. So the way this works is a company might have a lot of money, like after-tax profits. What does it do with that money? It can take that money and invest in its own operations, or it can take that money and pay dividends to its shareholders, or it can take that money and buy back the shares of its shareholders. Now, that doesn't mean the money doesn't get invested. When a company why does it buy back the shares rather than pay dividends? Because capital gains taxes are lower than dividend taxes. So it's entirely a tax question. It also allows people to make their choice whether they want the cash now or not. And a lot of America has very high income taxes at the high end compared to the rest of the world. We're very progressive. So I don't want any dividends from any of my companies that I invest in, because if they pay me dividends, I have to pay taxes on it. If they offer a share repurchase, I can leave it there and I don't have to pay taxes on it. But where does that money go? This is a classic mistake in how people are thinking about economics. The one thing economists can offer a few things, and one of them is track the money a couple more steps down the line. So when you do a share repurchase, the company chooses to give money back to its investors rather than invest it. Where does the money go? Well, the investors take the money, and by and large, they don't want to blow billions of dollars on around the world tours or something of the sort. They use it to buy shares of other companies, companies who have needed investment. So in fact, share buybacks are a wonderful, wonderful thing, because what they do is they take money from companies who don't have particularly good investment ideas, and they give it to shareholders who find companies who do have good investment ideas, and it winds up invested in companies that have good investment ideas. In fact, the whole share buyback thing used to be illegal in the US. And it was made legal as part of a bunch of reforms, liberal reforms in the 1970s. And the point of the reforms was people noticed that big corporations were taking their profits and they were investing them in corporate jets and fancy offices and buying out other companies to aggrandize the size of the CEOs. They were being wasted. A lot of investment can get wasted. And so share buybacks were exactly a way to get the money into the hands of the companies that needed it. So that was ridiculous. Now, the other thing you said was that the corporate tax is a handout to the rich. That's also ridiculous. First of all, not every individual change must always be more redistributive. We should, as economists, look at the big picture. How redistributive is the entire tax code and the entire set of taxes and subsidies and benefits and so forth? Not does this particular step redistribute from rich to poor. So it's just silly to take anything in isolation. Second, the corporate taxes, you have to remember, every cent, every florin of corporate taxes is not paid by the company. It's paid by higher prices, lower wages, or lower returns to investors. That's just a fact. Companies are not pots of gold to be taxed. Largely, if you think about the economics of it, it comes from lower wages and higher prices. It falls on consumers. So the idea that we're going to tax the rich by taxing corporate, if you want to tax the rich, tax the rich. And finally, corporate taxes. Why do we not like corporate tax? Not because we love corporations. First, the principle is you should always think about people. Corporations are just a way of funneling money to people. So you want to tax rich people in particular. Another big principle of taxation is you should tax consumption, not when investment. When you tax a corporate tax means that suppose you earn some money. Good. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to go out to dinner, or are you going to invest it in a company? Well, if you invest it in a company, then your investment money produces a rate of return, which then gets taxed at the corporate level and then gets taxed again at the individual level. And you don't see the full rate of return. So we're giving a strong disincentive to people to invest, create better factories, better companies, and so forth. So it's much better to not charge the corporate tax, not charge taxes on rates of return, but to make a consumption tax. All those rich people you're worried about, get them at the Porsche dealer. Don't, let them invest the money, let them get ridiculously rich with the money, fine. Tax them at the Porsche dealer when they start spending it. And that's a much more efficient, fair, economically sensible way to do it.
The next Trump policy I would like to discuss with you was the trade war. And it seemed that there was a much wider agreement amongst economists that this is not the way to solve the current account deficit problems of the United States, and saying that the trade war itself was nonsense. And some years have passed now, and we've put it into a larger context of also being a national security measure, or also a measure of protecting intellectual property. So what do you think about the trade war? Was there any sense to it, or is it just a pure distilled catastrophe?
Well, it's not a catastrophe. I reserve catastrophes for the return of communism, which older people in Hungary might tell you something about. But it was stupid policy. It was, a step backwards. It's kind of interesting how medieval economic concepts remain with us. The idea that the nation is made better off by exports and hurt by imports, which is, the point. Why do you export anything? The point of exports is to earn the currency that you can use to buy the imports. The point of working is to earn the currency that you can use to go to the store and buy stuff. Exports and imports are the same way. Indeed, if the Chinese are willing to put things on boats and send them to us, and all we have to do is print up pieces of paper and send them back, hallelujah, it's much cheaper to print up pieces of paper. We should be sending them flowers and chocolates and a nice thank you note. Now, of course, the Chinese aren't that dumb. The point of putting stuff on boats and getting pieces of paper, those pieces of paper must come back to the U.S. That's the only reason people accumulate dollars is sooner or later to either invest in the U.S. to build our new companies or to buy stuff from the U.S. Now, the political problem is, of course, that demand is spread out all over the place, and we don't really see it, whereas the people who compete with the Chinese exporters go to Washington and complain a lot. So I would, the word trade deficit needs to be banished because and you said problem. What problem? There's another common thing in economics is to always call any change as bad and to use medieval labels that a trade deficit is therefore a problem. You mentioned national security. So trade is good, period. Mutually advantageous trade is always good. And if there are people who have lost jobs and businesses due to competition from China, but there's people who lose jobs and businesses due to competition from businesses moving to the south of the US where there aren't unions. There's people who use jobs and businesses to technology all the time. Those are far greater sources of change than competition from China. And in fact, the billion people in China escaping abject poverty in the last 25 years is the greatest thing that's ever happened. Global inequality has sharply reduced. Global poverty is way down. Why? Because China grew and India grew a little bit. So we should be cheering that. Now, China has some political problems that is not an economic, which brings us to national security. So everybody likes to cloak protectionism in national security, and it's usually a joke. When I was very young, I served on the Council of Economic Advisors in a classic case. We had two classic cases. The American Goose Down companies wanted protection from cheap imported goose down, to make coats with. So they called it a national security case, because when our boys are fighting the Ruskies up in the north there, you don't want them to be having cheap imported goose down now, do you? And we might run out of a strategic pile of goose down. Similarly, nuts, bolts, and screws came up. China was starting to produce cheap nuts and bolts and screws. Well, you wouldn't want an F-15 fighter to fall apart because it's got a cheap Chinese screw in it now, would you? Which is all ridiculous. Aviation parts are all made in America to very exacting standards. Now there is, I highly recommend a weekly chat I have with Neil Ferguson and H.R. McMaster called the Goodfellows Conversation, where we fight about this every week, because there's a strong part of America now that wants to start a industrial policy to have a national campaign to outcompete China. Competitiveness is another word we need to banish from international trade. And that's a big danger, because centrally planned economies never outcompete on centrally planned economies. You brought up IP, which is a really, really subtle issue. And here I want to, so again, Americans are, the Chinese are stealing our intellectual property. Just came up again with the vaccine intellectual property question. This is a tough one, actually. You might think of, intellectual property like other property, can't steal it, terrible. But intellectual property stealing intellectual property is the key to growth. Intellectual property has this, it's different from physical property. If you steal my house, I can't live in my house. If you steal my idea for producing microphones, I can still use that idea for producing microphones. It's not a rival. So in fact, it is not, there's reasons our intellectual property laws don't say you have exclusive rights to this technology forever. They grant you a limited right to use that technology for a limited amount of time in order to encourage people. You get a limited monopoly. Monopolies are bad, remember? Intellectual properties are a monopoly. Wait, but monopolies are bad. Why is it so important to have monopolies? Well, our system is we grant you a limited time to have a monopoly to make some money in order to give people incentives to come up with intellectual property, which otherwise is easy to steal. But that should be limited. It shouldn't go on forever. And just how much of it we should have and for how long is an open question. So yeah, China is stealing intellectual property. Yeah, let's at least debate the laws. But like all laws, let's think about where these laws are sensible and where these laws are not sensible. And a great place where they're not sensible is what just got done. The U.S. is now joining the idea of stealing the intellectual property of vaccine makers. Now Mickey Mouse is intellectual property. And you're still not allowed to use the Mickey Mouse cartoon 75 years after it was invented. That's just rents. There's no incentive being provided to the creation of new Mickey Mouses by that. But this vaccine case is I think, a case, a really important case to think about intellectual property. Why did the vaccine companies not license the intellectual property of vaccines to third world countries? Well, because first of all, the other countries won't release them from liability. So if the vaccine companies ship the vaccine and somebody gets sick, then you can get sued for $1 gazillion in some court somewhere. They don't want that. In fact, the intellectual property then allows them to make the vaccine, which is very hard to do. And then if it gets made badly in some third world country and somebody gets sick, then they get sued for $1 gazillion. You can see why they're not wanting to license this stuff. And of course, the one thing you need to know about cost benefit analysis, this is Alex Tabrock, is that billions is less than trillions. We're fighting about couch change. Even fighting about $1 billion, lately there was, Robert Reich went on, drug companies are making billions in profits. Thank you. They just saved the world at least $10 trillion a year by stopping this pandemic. The greatest miracle of modern science ever. If they make $10 billion out of it, flowers and chocolates. We need more flowers and chocolates in economic policy. If the U.S. wants to give away fine, let the taxpayer. We just spent $2 trillion on the last stimulus bill, $100 billion to the vaccine companies, and a thank you card. And be ready to do that again. This pandemic is not over, and the next pandemic will come. And we want those drug companies fast moving in order to develop better vaccines, ones that go up your nose, ones that don't need to be stored, vaccines that get the next variants. And there's nothing like the profit motive to do that, and to get them going on the very difficult part of manufacturing vaccines. So every time you ask a question, you get a 10-minute answer. Sorry about that. So
that's
watch
great.
questions.
Yeah. And you have actually raised many interesting questions, so I could react to any of those. But I've written many questions which are also interesting. But as you mentioned, I wanted to ask you about the developments yesterday about the intellectual property, of vaccine makers, because in the short term it might seem as a great solution. As you know, many people around the world could just start making vaccines and therefore decreasing the severity of the pandemic in the short term, but in the long term it might actually disincentivize vaccine development. Do you agree with this assessment?
I would just emphasize that the barrier to producing vaccines in other countries is not intellectual property and the refusal of the evil drug companies to let you do it. They're trying hard to license its production, but in return for their license, they want some protection against rampant lawsuits. And producing vaccines is very difficult. And they want quality control over how these things are going to be produced. The amount of money they're asking for in the license is trivial. So the idea of we need to steal this intellectual property so that third world countries can afford to do it is just ludicrous. Billions is less than trillions. And this is just a clear case where we need them to be around next time. In fact, we shouldn't be stealing their profits. I think the world as a whole should give them a bonus. How about a prize? Every vaccine that's now in production, how about $50 billion to everybody who's producing a vaccine that is now, being able to be used? I don't like taxes in general, but I'll sign up to pay taxes for that one. And please be around next time.
Okay, the next thing I would like to talk about is the first COVID stimulus bill at the beginning of last year, which was quite unprecedented, not in size, because in size we've seen something similar after the 2008 financial crisis, but in composition. And such a huge direct cash flow to many people was something that is unprecedented. And I was thinking that after 2008, there were many debates about deficits, the size of government stimulus, and this time it was treated as evident that this stimulus has to be passed, and there were no debates. Back in 2009, Paul Krugman had to write a book about why we need these deficits. Now there was no need for Paul Krugman. He could see that he was obviously right. So I would like to ask you how the economic thinking has changed in more than 10 years, around 11 years, that there were no serious debates and there was no need for serious justification for such huge COVID stimulus bills.
Yeah, it's sad. What we hope of a competent society and government is that we learn from our mistakes and that we don't just fight the last war the same way the last war was fought. Instead, we seem to be going in a direction that whatever was done last time is enshrined as being the perfect thing that has to be done again, without question. At least, as you mentioned, at least in the last time, we had the good sense to question, why are we doing this, and can we set things up so we don't have to do it next time? And now the same policy things just went into place without thought and without ex post thought. Particularly curious because it's different. A pandemic is different from a financial crisis. Financial crisis, you can sort of start thinking about in terms of aggregate demand or something of the sort. Not really. This was a pandemic. We know why the stores are closed. The stores are not closed because people don't have enough money. The stores are closed because the stores are closed. So the whole idea of fighting it with aggregate demand, as opposed to competent public health, which we didn't have. It's funny, we fight over, 10 billion for public health, and then just $1 trillion goes out the money in checks to people. Particularly so you mentioned the stimulus checks. I like to make sure, keep up my bipartisan or nonpartisan credentials. And so I'll criticize here. George W. Bush was the first one in America, the first president in America to send checks directly to every registered voter. Well, okay, it wasn't every registered voter, it was every taxpayer, but you know what I mean. That this just ought to go down in history as how countries bankrupt themselves. And of course, this becomes addictive. Now, we needed there was a need for a robust government response here. You don't want all of your restaurants to go bankrupt. You don't want a chain of bankruptcies. So there was a need. In a crisis, what you do is you try to keep the financial system afloat, and you try to provide insurance. The government is sort of an ex post insurer. And so you should borrow money and spend it wisely on businesses that are needlessly going to go bankrupt otherwise, especially small businesses who can't otherwise borrow, on people who are, thrown out of their jobs for no good reason, no fault of their own. You want to kind of keep things afloat, and that would make sense. But a check to every single voter, wait a minute, government workers who are getting their salaries fine, why do they need a check? Retirees who are cashing. Now, everybody loves a check, everybody loves a check. Who can object to checks? But as far as, actually fighting the thing that needed to be fight, that was a complete waste. I'll go on. So the Federal Reserve pitched in here on a massive bailout. The first one actually was the U.S. Treasury, who it turned out could not sell bonds, and the Fed is still buying all of the Treasury's bonds. The Fed went on to bail out money markets. This is a classic one. They bailed out money market funds. In 2008, money market funds had a run. The Fed bailed them out, even though there's no guarantee of doing that. And then there was at least the decency of saying, well, we need to reform this so we don't bail it out again. Here we are. Boom. Exactly what we said we would never do again. We bailed out the airlines. Airlines are now too big to fail, it turns out. We bailed out, the Fed said that they would not let corporate bond prices fall. So the Fed, they didn't have to in the end. They did a Mario Draghi will do what it takes on corporate bond prices. When you're in trouble, you bail out, but at least you have the decency to think about the moral hazard that got you here and to try to contain it. Why were the airlines all so thin of cash that they were going to go bankrupt otherwise? Well, because everybody in America knows the Fed is coming in the bad states and will bail everybody out. So the incentive to hold some cash around, to be able to weather a storm, to keep some extra equity around, to be able to handle some risk, that incentive is now gone. We're in a bailout in every slight recession economy, which is going to make the next one bigger. So last time, at least there was the decency to say, let's try to put the genie back in the bottle. Now we just said, well, whatever we did last time was great. And I fear, so this pandemic, we need to recognize, was mild. It feels awful. But on the scale of historical pandemics, the death rate from this one was small and was concentrated in old people. Now, as an increasingly old person, I don't like that, but old people tend not to work. And so they're not really that damaging to the economy when they go. Other pandemics kill 10, 20, 30% of the people who are involved. A vaccine does not come to the rescue in a year, and they kill young people. So this was small. So how are we going to fight that next one? Is it going to be $30 trillion of money thrown out the window, or is it going to be a little bit of a competent public health? And other crises are coming, and America is very lucky that we've been able to fight this one with a tiny bit of public health and $7 trillion of borrowed money. But that ability is not going to be there forever.
We will talk about monetary financing later, but just before that, you've mentioned the cost-benefit analysis, and you talk a lot about it on Goodfellows. And there was an interesting book by Casey Mulligan about how the administration approached the cost-benefit approach when it comes to government regulation. And it was kind of stunning, because if you think about it, you might as well think that the government approaches this, it's kind of natural. They do this cost-benefit analysis. If the government does something, they think about the consequences. And you talk about it a lot, that it's not an evident case. They put in many elements from climate change to racial equity and all that, but they don't do the cost-benefit analysis. So how is it, and how the US public policy has moved on on this topic, and did the Trump administration mean a huge improvement regarding cost-benefit analysis approach?
So just to fill in, so cost-benefit analysis is an idea that when you think this was always done, but it's not, when you promulgate a regulation, that you should try at least to get some sense of what are the benefits and quantify those benefits in some sense in terms of dollars, and what are the costs, both the direct costs and the cost to the economy, because there are trade-offs. If a safety improvement on an automobile, if it's going to save one life every year, but it's going to cost $5 billion to the economy, I'm sorry for that one life a year, but there are other ways to use $5 billion that could save 100 lives a year. So it's a good discipline. Now, as you can tell, it's easy to cook the numbers. So cost-benefit analysis was already difficult, but usually it just wasn't done at all. So part of the structure of making regulations in the US used to be, regulations weren't just the administrator says, gee, I think we're going to do this. There was a process, there was public comment, you had to respond to public comment, you had to do cost-benefit analysis, you had to explain how it was done, people could challenge the cost-benefit analysis. That process was getting better slowly over time. Lots wrong with it still. So in the US, the way it worked is you did the cost-benefit analysis ahead of time. But 10 years afterwards, when it turned out all the numbers were completely bogus, nobody forced you to redo the cost-benefit analysis and say, gee, is this regulation really actually helping with now the knowledge of history? So there was, why don't we have retrospective cost-benefit analysis? Why don't we force regulations to rethink things? And that was a good thing slowly. We have now taken a sharp turn in the opposite direction. You mentioned, so this is something that most people don't know. There was one of Biden's first executive orders was essentially to gut cost-benefit analysis, to say that regulations don't have to do cost-benefit analysis, or when they do, they have to include costs such as, now I'm going to get the quote wrong, but equity goals and justice goals and community goals and so forth, which basically means you can justify anything you want. This is particularly disturbing to me in the current climate regulation. Now, let me make clear, the climate, the Earth is getting warmer, climate is changing. We need to do something about it, but we need to, since the worst damage effects are on the order of 5-10% of GDP in 100 years, which is, basically we'll lose 5 years of growth. It's not the end of Western civilization. We need to not end Western civilization right now in order to stop this. We need to do it efficiently. This is a classic case where, so my Palo Alto neighbors think that the way to stop climate change is to trade in the Range Rover for a Tesla that they can drive down to their private jet, which is going to take them to Fiji. That kind of thing doesn't work on a cost-benefit basis. You have to do, you have to put a price on carbon. Even if it's not a carbon tax, you have to say, look, it's worth $200 per ton to get off carbon. Don't stuff that costs $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 per carbon for a ton of carbon reduced, you shouldn't do, and instead focus things on that do. It's just a way of thinking about what's smart and what's dumb in terms of policy. So, as an example, California is building a high-speed train in order to reduce carbon. The budget cost is $80 billion. It'll save a thimbleful of carbon, if any at all. That's just a waste of money. And that money could be, I want to put it environmentally, that money could be used to better things. That's what cost benefit analysis disciplines you to do. Well, that's been thrown out the window in the climate policy, even though that's the place where you would think cost benefit analysis would we just say, here's everything you do. I want to see $200 per ton of carbon saved to make this efficient. But, the stuff that we're doing, Biden wants to put electric car charging stations all the way across Wyoming. I just don't, we don't even bother to cook up fake numbers anymore in doing this, which is a guaranteed way to waste a lot of money and, more importantly, to not help the climate.
Also, you did an episode on California in Goodfellows, and I suggest everybody watches that, because that's a great case study of how to screw up things, basically. I suggest we move on to not the Biden years like the Trump, but the Biden months. And you didn't give a grade to President Trump, so I think you wouldn't give a grade to President Biden. So I would ask you instead, from a scale from 0 to libertarian anarcho-capitalist nirvana, how does the Biden administration stand?
Yeah, well, if the Trump got a 1 on 0 to, well, not 0 is pretty bad. If Trump took us a small step in the direction, obviously they are taking some rather large steps in the opposite direction. And let me try to say some things that are not that will be original. Why do I worry about their spending plans? So, among other things, the U.S. is voting in some big new entitlements, free pre-K, a lot of more unionization of the workforce, a lot of union regulations, a new benefit for home health care that the federal government will pay for. There's a big problem on how we're going to pay for all this stuff, but I think that misses the biggest problem of all. All of our benefits are income tested, means tested. So if you earn an extra $1 in the US, it's very easy to lose $1.50 worth of benefits, because so much of the stuff only applies to X income limit. And many of these have cliffs in them. So if you earn more than X thousand dollars, you are no longer eligible for your housing subsidy. Bing, make darn sure you don't take that new job. If you earn more than X thousand dollars, you lose your subsidized health insurance. Bing, make sure you don't earn more than X thousand dollars. My colleague Casey Mulligan estimates roughly it's 100% marginal tax rate. And all of this is being made worse. So I think the biggest danger from this stuff, eventually, if the U.S. goes this way as far as the spending on it, the question is, when do we pass a VAT? And when do we first expropriate a lot of wealth and then promise never to do it again and pass a VAT, sort of passing what Europe did, except 20, 30 years after the fact. But the big danger is that this really hurts the people it's designed to help. There is a problem in lower income America, lower income and minority America. I see that problem as a problem of lack of opportunity due to all of the things in their way. Horrible public schools, zoning that makes it impossible to live near where the good jobs are, occupational licensing, and the disincentives of the social programs. And so all of this is being made worse. And not only will it eventually hurt the whole economy, but it will hurt the people who they pretend to want to help the most.
Looking from here, the US is actually becoming much more like Europe, which might just ruin your mood, actually, as I've seen some of your blog posts.
Not entirely. So there's some, I must say, Europe is not on a fiscal cliff like the US, because Europe pays for its entitlements with high taxes. And Europe's taxes are, for their level, not as distorting as America's taxes, because you tax the middle class. It's just, America doesn't want to tax the middle. They have this idea that can be all paid for by the rich. So Europe is screwed up in a lot of ways, and low growth, low productivity in Europe is a really big and heartbreaking problem. Europe is 40% poorer than the US, and this is France and Germany, who don't have the excuse of communism. And that's due to their economic policies, and that's a real tragedy. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. Also about raising taxes and backing up the entitlements. Biden has raised some issues about partly reversing the Trump tax cuts, raising the corporate income tax. Actually, there was a proposition about the global minimum corporate tax, which would affect Europe as well, just as Hungary. Also raising the capital gains tax for the richest, and also the most rich could face an inheritance tax, combined inheritance tax rate of around 61%. So there might be some changes in the tax system, And there are many ambitious plans as well. So my question would be, and they say this, that raising these taxes could actually finance all those expenses. And looking at the scale of expenses, it seems quite impossible. So do you think that the numbers make up, or is it just bogus economics, and in the end they will have to print the money and finance it through monetary financing?
Yeah, no, so the idea that this is going to do anything on raising revenue is no, and then it's actually kind of funny. Up until exactly about a month ago, the administration, even Janet Yellen was saying this. Look, we don't have to worry about taxes because interest rates are lower than the growth rate on the government, growth rate of the economy. So interest rates are so low, we don't need to raise taxes. We can just borrow all the money we want. And then bing, all of a sudden, we got to pay for this stuff. We need to raise the corporate tax. Let's not forget that about 10 seconds after Trump announced he wanted to lower the corporate tax, a Democratic idea, the Democrats flipped and said, we can't lower the corporate tax. This is a bailout for the rich. They have wanted to raise corporate taxes quite independently of raising revenue ever since the 10 seconds after Trump said he wanted to lower corporate taxes. So the idea that the corporate taxes was, we need to spend some money. Gee, where can we raise the money? Let's raise corporate taxes. That just flies in the face of the history of this thing. They've been saying raise corporate taxes forever. Now, where does this, I think, I want to try to give people the idea, let's use some economics to think about things. And when people are coming up with different answers, these are very smart people. The economists in the administration I know are both honorable, smart, and well-intentioned. So if they're coming up with different answers, they must be asking different questions. So we, I think, take as granted that the point of taxation is to raise revenue for the government in order to finance needed, worthwhile, useful spending, and to do so with minimum distortion to the economy, right? His video is off, so I can't say, is that the idea? But that's the, now, obviously, when they come up with such a different answer, with an answer that doesn't do this, they must have a different question in mind. And that's kind of interesting on where political discussions of the US tax code are going. If you want to understand US taxes in terms of raise revenue without distorting the economy, everything we do makes no sense whatsoever. And this move to raise the corporate tax, high income taxes, wealth taxes, and estate taxes makes even less sense. The one tax we know is on the other side of the Laffer curve, that when you raise this tax, you get less revenue, is the capital gains tax. And the reason for that is it's very easy to avoid. If they put in a capital gains tax, don't realize capital gains, leave the stuff invested. The estate tax is also, like corporate taxes, the last place you want to tax is where people have lots of smart lawyers. So in fact, the estate tax, it mostly hits people with like $10 to $20 million who don't have enough money to really hire good lawyers. But people with gazillions of dollars who know how to hire good lawyers, you just structure things in enormously complicated ways. I remember reading, there's an article, a left-wing article that said how great the estate tax was because the government was actually earning more money on it than people were spending in lawyers' fees to avoid it. By about, they were earning about $2 for every dollar in lawyers' fees. Come on, guys. And American tax system, what we do, a lot of it, so why are we doing what we're doing? A lot of it is political virtue signaling. We want to say we have big taxes, but we don't want to actually charge our donors big taxes because, who supports the Democratic Party? It's the tech gazillionaires. So what do? We put in place a big tax, but then the tax code is 100,000 pages long. And deep down there, you'll find a special dividend exclusion for companies that are headquartered somewhere. And, I know some of these tricks. I can tell you some of the tricks you use to get away with taxes. So they're coming up with a different answer. It must be for a reason. Part of it is sort of signaling we hate corporations, we like people. Part of it is an attempt at redistribution. It's not redistribution. It's execution. The point, and they're I read Stephanie Kelton's book, Modern Monetary Theory, which has a logical conundrum to it. She's a good exponent of thinking on the left. She says the government doesn't have to worry about taxes. We can just borrow money and print money to do whatever we want. Well, Stephanie, if you can just print money, why do you tax anything at all? And she thought about this. She says, the only reason is because we want to get rid of the rich. So it's at least it's not there to raise revenue for the government at minimal economic distortion. It's also there to provide the tax code is set up so that people can come to Congress every year and ask for their annual extender deep into age 122. So I think, economists should always look at an outcome and say, what's the question to which is the answer, not just, boy, this is dumb.
Okay, before we move on to the monetary financing and what I've called the new monetary paradigm, but it's not that new, I just encourage everybody to ask questions, write questions, or raise your hands, and I will translate it or read it out loud or just unmute you. So you write a lot about inflation and the possible risks of rising inflation. In the short run, I think there is widespread agreement between economists that we will see some higher levels of inflation. The question is whether in the long term we will see permanent high inflation. And of course, it's a percentage, like you have a chance to see that. So how high is this chance you see for permanent higher levels of inflation in the long run due to monetary financing?
Yeah, so first of all, my big thing is called the fiscal theory of the price level these days. And so I don't see much of an importance in the distinction in today's economy between money and government debt. So I think it's the overall size of government debt that endangers us rather than whether we're holding that debt in the form of so-called money or not. So you got to understand, money these days is interest-paying accounts at the Federal Reserve. And really, what difference does it make if you have $1 trillion of government debt in the form of interest-paying accounts at the Federal Reserve or $1 trillion of actual government debt? The Federal Reserve is just a big money market fund. It issues these reserves and it holds government debt. So you're just holding government debt indirectly versus directly. So the issue is, when does large deficits reduce inflation? And here, I think they are to some extent right. There's caution. Our Treasury and Fed have said, wait a minute, this isn't necessarily. We start from a low base. So there was a blog post I did on this a while ago. Prices went down in the COVID recession, and they're now back up again. So what looked a little deflation then matches a little inflation now, and you can make a case prices are just coming back to where they were. You can also make a case we have some supply chain bottlenecks and stuff like that. The COVID is ending much faster than the chip makers thought it would end, and the car makers thought it would end, and the strawberry makers thought it would end. So it is true that there are going to be supply chain bottlenecks and temporary things like that. It's also true our companies are trying in the US desperately to hire and can't find workers, in some part because the US government pays people about $22 an hour not to work. So why would you bother going back to work until that ends? So there is a case to be made that what we'll see is a one-time increase in prices, but that does not lead to permanent inflation. So when does this lead to embedded inflation? Here's where I worry. I think there's two forces in mind. So inflation gets embedded when people think there's going to be inflation in the future. When do you, as a worker, hold out for higher wages? Well, if you think wages are going to be higher in the future, you might as well stay home a little while longer now. As a producer, you're much more willing to raise prices today if you think everyone else is going to be raising prices within the next 6 months or so. So that's the sense in which expectations do get embedded into inflation. And that's when inflation kind of gets going and has a momentum of its own. I think our Fed takes this much too lightly. They just say, oh, expectations are anchored. And they say, oh, well, we have the tools. The only reason I think expectations are anchored is people think our central banks have the guts to redo what they did in 1980. Now, this is ancient history for you guys, but there was this inflation back in the 1970s, which was ended around 1980 by sharp interest rates that went to 20% in the US and a horrible recession, which, by the way, hurt minorities far more than it hurt everybody else. And so the only thing that anchors on the Fed side is belief that they would be willing to do this again. And boy, oh boy, do you not see, you would at least hope, it's like fighting a nuclear war. You want people to think you might do it. And if you say, no, we'd never do it, well, then the whole thing is useless. And then there's the fiscal overhang. The other place I see inflation coming out is when investors say to the U.S., you guys are not just paying this stuff off. I want to get rid of my U.S. government debt, and that means buying stuff. That's a force that's much harder to. There's nothing the Federal Reserve can do about that. Then you're in a full-blown Greek-style debt crisis with no Germany to bail you out, and only inflation as the way out of it. And that it would just be so horrible. I can't even begin to think of how horrible it is. Now, I don't think that's coming soon. I think that sort of thing comes in the next crisis. I think as long as the economy booms ahead, you can shove a lot of damage under the rug as long as the economy is booming. But if in the next crisis, imagine the U.S. still politically completely at odds with each other. The Congress is impeaching the president again. Everything's before the Supreme Court. There's riots in the streets, and another pandemic comes or a war. We need to borrow $10 trillion, and we still have never cured the entitlements. We have no plan for paying it back. I think that's when we run into trouble.
Should have written doom, like Neil Ferguson did. It was just a great doom scenario. Danny raised his hand. Do you have a question, Danny?
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Cochrane, about the interesting presentation. My question would be that you mentioned about the Chinese US relationship, and in the last couple of weeks, or actually last week, I'm just wondering on that the kind of first issues after the burst of COVID pandemic was about that how the trade balances are relying on the Chinese economy. And now in the last week came out that in India started peaking the COVID-19 crisis and its pandemic. And how do you think that will we have some kind of conclusion about that now a lot of services, especially in the IT, are outsourced to India? And do you think that, what do you think about that, the risk related to that how generally US, UK, and also Western Europe economies, and especially banking sectors and other big companies are relying on the Indian service sector in India? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And are you in a brewery, or what's your background there?
It's a distillery. Actually, in my main profession, I'm an alumni of this college, and as a head of alumni association, and I work for Diageo, which is a company with kind of beverages and stuff like that. So but it's from a Scotland distillery, but it's a kind of artificial background.
That's too bad, because I was going to say, you look like you have the happiest place to be doing a seminar.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
So this pandemic did bring about immediately nationalism. That in part we blame the Chinese for not sending us stuff, but in part the U.S. would not. Our regulators would not allow us to use Chinese imported masks, even when we needed Chinese imported masks. Export controls went in. The U.S. has done it just like everybody else, invoking the Defense Production Act. So we're in very shoddy ground for complaining that the Chinese won't send us stuff when we refuse to send stuff to other countries. I do think we all learned. Now, globalization has to be here to stay. This has caused so much immense benefit to everybody around the globe the trade deficits with China are larger than they ever have been. The container ships are backed up weeks in the ports in the U.S. to bring stuff in. So the idea that we're going to adopt North Korean self-reliant economic policy and everybody make their own thing is that would be a massive step back economically. I think the right answer is, first of all, international agreements. Guys, we don't do this. We don't close borders. We don't stop down trade in order to try to restrict stuff for our domestic citizens. That's just that is a violation of international law every bit as, it's. Would you send your army to go with guns, take stuff from the other country? Well, if you're not willing to do that, an export ban is exactly the same thing. So, I think it's both morally and economically outrageous. But I do think we learned throughout the pandemic there's a need for more resiliency. Don't rely on a single supplier who happens to be located in China. Maybe you should have multiple suppliers. Don't run your business down to the absolute last dollar of borrowed money. Maybe you should have some extra cash hanging around. Maybe you should have some extra, dear banks, how about having some extra capital hanging around? So resilience in global supply chains, I think, is a necessary thing. But bringing everything back on shore is just ridiculous nationalist protectionism and will not work. Instead, we need a international understanding. We're all in this together, even though we have political disagreements. Do stuff like this, and the biggest non-resilience. It seems like the entire world depends on one chip factory in Taiwan. And let me tell you, one chip factory in Taiwan sounds like a pretty dangerous place to base an entire economy on, to me.
Actually, I wrote a question about global trade and supply chains, but you've already answered. So thank you for the question, Don. You just thought the same way I would. Just to get back to inflation, because I wrote a question and I will ask two questions at the same time. One of the questions I wrote is how is today's situation different from that of the 70s? But you partially gave an answer because you said it's about inflation expectations, that people believe that the central banks can actually contain it. But there has been a policy shift last year, and I'm really interested in your opinion about that, because the Federal Reserve announced that they're actually giving up their fixed inflation target from year to year, and they will look at average inflation in a longer term. So they are basically printing money, and they are giving up the inflation expectations, saying that, we will look at it in 10 years or such. So it seems like a really foolish policy in this form. Do you think that giving up this fixed inflation target and going back to average, or going to average, is going to have a significance in monetary policy and inflation?
So the 70s, history is never always the same. The 70s, those of you, you're all too young to remember, but it did have a breakout of inflation, along with stagnating economic growth, government finance problems throughout. Things were quite a bit different, so I wouldn't expect inflation to replay exactly the way it does. And the openness of international capital markets and floating exchange rates make, I think, a big difference in our ability to absorb the same kind of shocks that we were not in the 70s. As I've been starting to look at the 1972 episode, which is where inflation really got going in the US, and you would be amazed. Back then, I visited Europe in the 70s. We weren't allowed, there was a limit on how much currency we were allowed to take abroad. There was extensive capital controls throughout the country. So the US could not. Right now, the US sells gazillions of treasury bills abroad to finance trade deficits. We couldn't do it because capital markets were closed. All trade deficits had to be financed by gold, real bars of gold moving around, just hilarious. So there's a robustness in the international system that there wasn't then. Now, on the other hand, that robustness allows you to get much, much deeper problems. There was no way the U.S. was going to build 100% debt to GDP ratio, selling it just to people in the United States. On Federal Reserve policy, yes, I wrote a blog post on this recently, which if people are interested, I'll recommend. There's sort of a standard set of lessons from the 1970s of how Federal Reserve policy went wrong. And if you read the current framework, it smells of all of the things we were taught in graduate school are classic mistakes of the 1960s and 1970s. The first one was the static Phillips curve. So in the 1960s, our Keynesian economists thought that there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And they said, look, why don't we just put up with 3% inflation or 4% inflation, because that'll get us less unemployment. And it was a classic case at looking at a correlation and implying causation. And so they did it. And of course, as Milton Friedman famously predicted in 1968, the minute you try to exploit this correlation, it exploded. The current Federal Reserve says they want to let inflation run hotter in order to reduce unemployment of disadvantaged and marginalized groups and so forth. Well, I'm sorry, the permanently helping unemployment by more inflation, I thought was something we learned didn't work the last time we tried it. If you want to lower unemployment of disadvantaged groups, you got to get the microeconomic disincentives out of the way, occupational licensing, unions, and so on and so forth. In the 1970s, the Fed was criticized for always being too late. They waited until inflation got out of control. And then they suddenly, they let inflation run hot. And then they said, oh boy, we got to, and they went through the same set of excuses we're hearing now. Oh, it's just temporary shortages. It's just supply chain blockages. It's some ship that got stuck on the Suez Canal. This is a price reflation. It's not embedding permanent inflation. Boy, it all sounds the same. You were just missing the regrettable haircuts and bell-bottom jeans. Well, that's, what they are saying now they're going to do. They're going to let inflation run hot for a while before they do anything about it. So it does sound, it does sound a lot like repeating that stuff that we thought we learned was a bad idea in the 1970s.
We're approaching the end of this event, but I would like to move on to the selected topics in economics, and I will have to pick my favorites because we don't have much time. One of is inequality. You talk about that often, and I really like how you talk about inequality. It's really enlightening, and I always forward your newsletter to many of my friends. So this time I will provoke you that we have seen all the graphs from Thomas Piketty's book. The rich get richer, actually much richer, the poor get poorer, or at least they are stagnating their incomes. And there was some articles that actually it was translated to Hungarian by many portals that around a dozen people control half of the planet's wealth. Maybe you had the same articles in the United States, but still you say that inequality itself is not really informative, and it's not really a problem in itself, and the worries are exaggerated. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? How is that inequality doesn't matter?
So if you say that inequality is by itself a problem, then you say you must mean we are somehow made better off if Bill Gates loses $1,000 and each of us loses $100 because we're less unequal. That's the logical consequence of saying inequality is a problem. Well, how is that true? That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I do think many good people of good heart who worry about inequality, what they really mean is they worry about the lack of opportunities on the lower end of society and the barriers in the way of them getting better. And I think that is where there is common ground in many cases. Now, not in all cases, because when you scratch, at least not, I don't know about Piketty. Size was at once upfront about this, that the real thing was this idea that the rich have too much political power and that the government therefore should eliminate them. It's the French Revolution kind of inequality, that guillotining the rich will reduce their political power, or at least taking away their wealth. It's not obvious to me that shifting more political power to functionaries of the federal government is a good idea. And it's kind of funny because, at least in the US, all the big wealth that's politically active is on the left, not on the right. There are no conservative billionaires worrying about. But I would also, so these facts are not facts. The fact that the rich are getting richer is simply not true. You look at Piketty's R is greater than G, which is, it's kind of funny. R is greater than G when we worry about inequality, but R is less than G when we think about borrowing government debt, not having to pay it back. Could you make up your minds, please? But that is just false as a description of where today's ultra wealthy are. Today's ultra wealthy are people who started there: Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, although he's a lot less wealthy today than he was 2 days ago. These are people who started companies that created products of immense value to all of us and they got to keep, 0.1% of the value that they created for all of us. They are not the heirs of the rich of the 1980s. The inherited wealth is practically absent in the top, and they are certainly not the heirs of, I don't know, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, whoever was wealthy way back when. So the idea that this is just inherited wealth that grows is simply not true. The idea that the rich got richer is not true, because these are not the people who were rich in 1980. These are people who made their own fortunes and came from middle class backgrounds by and large. Many of them immigrants. When you think about inequality, it's very important, I think, to distinguish inequality of consumption, income, and wealth. The inequality of consumption is much less than the inequality of wealth, because it's simply impossible for Bill Gates to consume that much. What these people do, what Gates does with his massive wealth is mostly gives it away through a foundation, largely keeps it reinvested in a company that makes great products, depending how you feel about Microsoft versus Apple, but some people seem to like Microsoft, and employs lots of people. Just how much damage is Bill Gates' massive wealth doing in the Gates Foundation and reinvested in Microsoft? The Gates Foundation, by the way, contributes almost entirely to left-wing causes. Inequality of income, we get more unequal in income because we get more old people. Why? Because old people don't earn any income anymore. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We get a lot of it. My children count as income inequality because they're just starting their jobs. They're not getting paid a lot. But over their lifetime, they're going to be just fine. They're all going to earn a lot of money. So inequality of income just gets a lot of transitory things. It doesn't make any sense. You really want to think about inequality of lifetime consumption. Oh, and by the way, post-tax, Piketty and company, Piketty and Science tell you that the inequality has gotten bigger of income before taxes and transfers. Now, in the US, the marginal tax rates on the rich are above 70%. If you define inequality as inequality before taxes and inequality before transfers, the money that we send to poor people, you have defined a problem that is incapable of solution because no amount of redistribution will ever change it. So that's ridiculous. When you look at post-tax and transfer inequality of consumption, it is much, much smaller than inequality of income or wealth. It has not been getting dramatically worse over time, or dramatically larger. I shouldn't use the word worse. And we should all think about, what kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where there are no Bill Gateses, where there is nobody starting these innovative companies that do great things for the rest of us? And we all kind of enjoy some sort of social inequality after the government does it? Or do you want to live in a country where there's opportunity, where you can become the unequal person if you have a good idea and so forth? Do we want to destroy the incentives that the possibility of inequality gives you? Do you want your students, and you're all smart students from what I can tell, and you're working in hard majors? Why are you working in hard majors that take a lot of math and maybe taking hard jobs like running a distillery rather than going out and being social justice warriors? Well, because you get paid more for doing it after taxes. If we take all that away, the incentive to go out and try to become rich, will we not kill the golden goose? And the one good thing I heard, I saw a survey recently. People were asked the question, would you rather live in a free market society with some inequality, or in a society that is run by the government where everyone's much more equal, which, by the way, is not true. Ask your parents who lived under communism whether there was great equality under communism, or whether, in fact, things weren't, where there was no market inequality, but only party members knew how to get stuff that the rest of people couldn't get. The governments don't give you equality ever. Government control gives you even worse inequality. But asked which one do you want to live in, vast majorities around the world said, I'll take the free market with its inequality. And interestingly, that number was only about 26% voted for socialism in the US. It was like 3% in Vietnam and like 10% in China. So China and Vietnam are way ahead of us on tolerance for inequality as the price of robust economic growth and of opportunity for people in the lower end. You got to the social vision that what we will give you is a double wide trailer, a government check, and free methamphetamines, and enjoy your life is just a dreadful vision for what the less fortunate in our society should have. And that's the vision of our inequality warriors.
We're really approaching the end of the event, and I don't want to hold you up because you said you have to go.
I have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Okay, then I will go with another selected topic, which is quite interesting. I've read your review of Stephanie Kelton's book. You've already mentioned the deficit myth and modern monetary theory, and your criticism is very much aligned with those who say that modern monetary theory is basically about financing a leftist economic agenda, and saying that, of course, inflation matters, but not saying any specific about that, about where is the economy currently, where is the potential output, and how much should we stimulate it, how much are we able to print. So is modern monetary theory only that, or is there some more scientific side to it, and are there more intellectual debates about it? Something more advanced than Stephanie Kelton's book, which, as we can see from your criticism, is much more of a political agenda than an economic piece of literature.
Yeah, so I don't think we should dignify modern monetary theory with too much time here. It is, it's some warmed over stuff remembered from Abba Lerner in the 1940s. It is Kelton's book, at least, showed a remarkable lack of awareness of anything that had happened in economics since about 1945. Those of you who are economists will recognize the names, even Solo Samuelson, as well as Lucas Sargent, and the Milton Friedman barely appears there except for some political things. So we have science advances. We have thought about these things, and it doesn't even consider it. It doesn't hang together. There's a reason economics. So equations don't make economics right, but if you can't write the equations down, it's usually wrong. And it's remarkable and you can see that exactly. And Kelton has a lot of good points, but when you add up the points, they don't add up. Well, that's because you didn't try to write them down in equations and get them published in a journal, which would have forced you to think a little harder. She makes, let me just an example of a logical circle that fails to close. It is true that the United States need never default on its debt because the United States can print money to pay off our debts, unlike Argentina's, are denominated in dollars. So that's absolutely true. Therefore, we can borrow money, and if needed be, we can pay money to print it off. But let's think about that. Suppose we finance a $30 trillion Green New Deal by printing money. It's also true, by the way, she says inflation can always be controlled by raising taxes to soak up the extra money. Yep, that one's true. So let's borrow or print money to finance the $30 trillion Green New Deal, and let's pay back that borrowed debt by printing a lot of money. Guess what's going to happen? There's going to be inflation. Oh, how do we control the inflation? We raise taxes. So we borrowed a lot of money, and we ended up raising taxes to pay it off. That's called borrowing money and raising taxes to pay it off. That doesn't mean borrowing money is free. And she got very loose on, so when does inflation come? The book does not mention the 1970s. It does not mention any of the many episodes of inflation, sovereign default that have characterized the history of government finances forever. There might be some commission somewhere who will look and decide that maybe there's inflation somewhere and we need to raise taxes. Very, very vague on that question. So it doesn't hang together. It's an example of what happens when you let the political, the policy drive the economics. When I read the book, I was expecting a book about monetary theory. Instead, there was 90% of the book was, here's all the great things I want to spend money on. It was interesting, by the way. So Kelton and her friends on the left are remarkably conservative. They still want to spend money on needed infrastructure and helping people and community projects and so forth. Our modern monetary theory, the idea has taken over Washington because they borrow money just to hand it out in checks to voters. Not even Stephanie Kelton said, hey, let's borrow a lot of money and just write checks to people. They don't have to work. She wanted to put people to work in making community gardens better or something of the sort, but it didn't even occur to her. So Washington's bought this idea completely. The one good thing I'll say about modern monetary theory, it has been fun for me to watch my my very sophisticated sparring partners on the left, the Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard and Paul Krugman, who have been crying for 10 years that we need much more stimulus, that there's hysteresis in the economy. We need to borrow money and spend it. And then along comes Kelton, and they're going, whoa, wait a minute. We didn't mean that much borrowing money. So it at least it has forced them to be a lot clearer about the limits of their advocacy for borrowed and printed money and fiscal expansion.
Also, instead of modern monetary theory, I should have asked you about your research topic, something you wrote a book about last year. And I watched the lecture that you gave, and it is available on your blog. Something that you actually kindly offered to hold a lecture on, but I think for such an audience, it is more advanced. But it is the fiscal theory of the price level, and everybody who's interested, I suggest they watch that video, because yesterday I had around 5 courses, and I watched it in the evening as the 6th one. But it was really interesting and really enjoyable, and it was enlightening. So instead of explaining the whole model, I just ask you to give us the main policy implication of your theory, if it is possible. If I'm the prime minister and you have to tell me something based on your theory, what is the one thing that is the most important?
Government debt matters, and watch out. So I'll just, this is unfortunately, it's only a book draft, and it needs a serious diet. I tend to put my drafts up on my webpage to encourage people to read them and help me find all the mistakes, which has been very, people are really helping. And I hope to have a real book out in a year or so. The project is called The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. It's very academic, and it's really about rebuilding monetary economics from the ground up. You would think this is something we really know about, but actually, where does inflation come from on an academic, scientific equations basis is actually something that's been very unclear. Our central bankers tend to use a framework that's roughly mid-1970s ISLM. I recognize when you look at the gears turning in the head of central bankers. Sorry, my dog just saw a squirrel outside, so that's way more important than inflation. Yeah, be quiet. Oh, it's a cat. Here she goes.
Something that never happened.
This is what, yeah. Sorry about that. So it's an attempt to rebuild monetary theory from the ground up, and I think it's very exciting. I hope it replaces the existing theories. And if you're, thinking of research topics, if you're a graduate student thinking of research topics, I certainly encourage you to. There's lots of them in there. It's not unlike Kelton. It is not. There's lots of equations, and I'm trying to build a machinery that we can think about policy issues with. It doesn't have immediately big policy issues, other than money and debt are really the same thing these days. So if you want to think about controlling inflation in the shadow of a huge government debt, it's not going to be enough to simply say, we'll soak up the money by issuing even more debt. The total stock of debt and the government's ability to repay it really is the foundation on which inflation rests. And now central banks can make mistakes, but I can't think of a historic inflation that was caused entirely by a central bank screwing up when a government was running a very sound fiscal policy, running surpluses with projections of the future looking great. That inflation just doesn't happen in those cases. So it's always at least a monetary fiscal phenomenon. And I think in the deep case, really a fiscal phenomenon.
It was actually thought-provoking, so I tried to apply the theory to today's economic policies. So I think we're on a good way to achieve that. So congratulations, and we're really looking forward to the book when it comes out in its final form. So I have 2 more questions. One will be really short, but before that, Yeah, somebody's cheering for the full lecture on this. Yeah,
the full lecture on that, which I'm going to develop some full lectures on it, but that involves, so this is about developing some mathematical models, simple ones, but that you watch the machinery of the model and then try to think about the world. So you have to watch some equations float by. And we weren't going to do that today, I think, wisely.
And two questions. The first of all, there was a video on YouTube when you talk about the main problem being the sclerosis of economic growth. And also in the US, it also applies to Europe. So what is your main proposal? Because economists are often accused that, oh, they are analyzing economic policy and all that, hurting people, but they're actually not giving the solution to problems. And it's really difficult to project into the future. But mainly, what are the most important things, in your opinion, that we should do to avoid sclerosis of our economies?
So there's a tendency of economists, first of all, to do economics that satisfies a current political imperative, which I think is awful. But secondly, to constrain yourself to think about policies that you think are politically feasible right now, and in a less direct way to serve the interests of current politicians. And that, I think, is I think that's a mistake. I think what we should be doing is standing up and advocating for that libertarian nirvana, free market nirvana we talked about. Because if nobody ever says, here's the right answer, here's what libertarian nirvana looks like, we'll never get there. So when I talk about taxes, I say, well, we should just throw out the income tax, corporate tax, and estate tax and put in a VAT. Next question. And people, oh, John, that's not politically possible. Well, if I don't say it, it'll never be politically possible. And if you look in the history of the US on the things that people thought were politically impossible that turned out eventually to be political nothing burgers, we've made some enormous successes. So, civil rights are a classic example. People said, well, that'll never happen. Well, people insisted that it should happen, and it did happen. First, don't give up on the politically possible. Second, some economic frameworks to think about. What matters is the level of things, not the growth rate of things. So don't be seduced by politicians and economists who spend too much attention on growth rates. You want to look at global wealth and poverty. The astonishing thing is, the US is about $60,000 per year average income. Europe is about $40,000, a lot less. What's Hungary? Does anyone know Hungary's GDP per capita?
It's around 20,000 or something.
20,000. Okay. We're 3 times better off than you guys.
Yeah, I've noticed. Yeah.
Right. And, China, the big China is only about 15,000. And you go to Africa, you're talking 1,000. So on the scale of things, that's everything. And long-term growth is everything. Why are we, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents hoed potatoes just like your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, and were miserable for it. Why are we so much wealthier? Well, it doesn't have to do, frankly, with monetary policy. Certainly was not stimulus. It wasn't because the British government discovered borrowing money and sending checks to taxpayers in about 1700. Growth comes from growth and productivity. And growth and productivity comes from better ideas and the ability to enshrine those better ideas in new and innovative companies that make existing companies very, very unhappy. The dynamism of an innovative economy, that's where it comes from. And over a scale of decades, that's all that matters. Now, why don't I work on growth theory? Because I'm not as smart as Chad Jones and Paul Romer, who do work on growth theory. So you gotta work in economics where you think you have an answer, not just where the big questions are. But you got to keep in mind where the big questions are. And long-term growth is the big question. And let me just, a final pot shot on climate. People are all upset about climate change and so forth. But the best numbers is that climate change is 6% of GDP in 2100. That's 3 years of growth at 2% a year. And if we could bump up growth another 1 percentage point a year, the effect on human welfare would be just dramatically more than anything anyone is talking about with climate change. People talk about climate change, oh, it's going to hurt people in Bangladesh and sub-Saharan Africa worse than us. Those people are miserably poor, living on $1,000 a year. If you want to help those people, let's help their economies grow. and let's help their environmental problems. Their environmental problems are not carbon. Their environmental problems are dirty water, malaria, river blindness, trichinosis, all the things that economic development helps. Growth is not about GDP per capita. Growth is about better health, better life expectancy, better environment, all sorts of better happiness that's only vaguely correlated with GDP per capita. And that all comes from productivity. And that all comes from the ability of innovators to innovate and to bring those innovations in, no matter how much the incumbents are hurt and scream to politicians about it. That's the easy. It's economically easy and politically hard.
Actually, you just close this conversation better than politicians do who come to us. So congratulations on that. And one last thing, you have to promise that Goodfellows will go on after the pandemic. So it would be a bigger hit than the pandemic itself. It was also raised in the chat window. So can we be hopeful about Goodfellows going on even after the pandemic?
The fact that you tell us you're listening and send in an email and encourage the Hoover people to keep going on it. I'd like to keep going. Can I getting Ferguson to nail down an hour a week? Because he's such a busy guy, it's hard. But if we hear that it's valuable, we'll definitely keep doing it. I enjoy it tremendously.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John Cochrane. It's been a really great pleasure, and I think we've learned a lot, and it was a great discussion. It was really good to have you here, and I wish you all the best, and also your colleagues in Goodfellows, and we will be following your work and your blog and watch you on YouTube. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all of you in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much.
And of course, if you would visit Hungary or Central Europe, we would be more than welcome you.
Thank you. My last visit was in 2010. I spent a lovely 3 weeks in Szeged, and
really?
I thought was just a fantastic place. Yeah, I was flying in the World Gliding Contest down there, and enjoying the great restaurants of Szeged. So I formed a great. It was just a wonderful visit. So
if you can't, please contact.
All right. Good.
Thank you very much. Bye.